Good. So, is there any difference between a tax and an offering? How do you guys see the difference? We're both giving money for some ostensibly good things. It could both be misused. It could be put to good use. But what's the difference between a tax and an offering?
Tax is mandatory offering.
Yeah, very good, right? So what Ben said for all those online is that a tax is mandatory and an offering is up to your discretion, right? It's your decision to give, right? And a tax is something that they tell you what you have to give, and it's forced out of you, right? Is there any voluntary tax? Just give what you want? Not too much, right? I don't know how well they would do. But interestingly enough, I know of at least one business that figured out that if they don't charge for their service, but they just ask for whatever the consumer would contribute, they actually ended up making more than charging fees, right? So, and what propels you to want to give to something voluntarily is because you have some kind of a conviction that it's being put to good use, it's aligned with your values, you're getting something out of that, even if you're not directly getting something out of that, yeah? Okay, I thought I'd just take this little poll, but we are going to talk about what is the history of giving and tax and tithing in the church community, in our faith community, right? And does anyone know when the first, like if we're going to mingle those things, does anyone recall what was the first offering ever given? Anyone know? There's a record of this. It's in the history books. Cain and Abel, right? Good call, man. They gave the first offering, right, of what they had produced. So that's the first known offering, very early in our history. But we are studying right now a series on Deuteronomy, which is very exciting, right? I think some people had some confusion. They think Deuteronomy means like the second law, but onomy is knowledge, right? And then dude, of course, is dude. So it's a knowledge of the dudes is really what Deuteronomy translates into. And so we are getting this great historical knowledge from ancient times. And what happened here is, in the context, just to remind you guys, people of Israel had been enslaved. People of Israel had been wandering the desert for generations, right? So it was from an environment of scarcity, precarious existence, not a lot of security, not a lot of safety, not a lot of ability to even provide for themselves. They were completely dependent on God in this hostile environment. And they had been taken, they were going to be taken to the promised land, flowing of milk and honey, a place where they were able to be secure and safe and productive. And as they're going in, there's this desire to set up this nation that has been guided and blessed by God, and a desire to create a set of added components to the law that had been given to give further instructions to God's people on how they should live, right? That's what we get in some in Numbers and here in Deuteronomy and in spades in Leviticus. And so what we're getting, if you look at Deuteronomy, is outlining this is how you should live. Don't forget who brought you here. Worship your God. Don't get tempted to worship other gods. This is how to worship your God. This is where to worship your God. You get some things about this is what you should and shouldn't eat. And then we get to a point where we start hearing about arranging of finances and tax, and it's called a tithe, right? Now, the first mention of tithe that we get, and there's three components, I don't know if you guys realize this, to the tithe that is outlined here in the Old Testament. And the first tithe that is mentioned in Numbers 18, and chapter 18, and it's a tithe that we've called the Levitical tithe. And this, anyone know what amount is associated with tithe? That's actually what that word means. 10%, right? 1/10. Tithe, tenth. So 1/10 was directed to be given to the Levite tribe, right? Anyone know what the duty of the Levites were? To take care of the temple, right? This was the priestly tribe. All the other tribes had been given land. Keep in mind, guys, this is a rural society. This is agricultural society. So your means of production is the land, right? It's like in modern times we would have said God gave everyone a coding class in a different language, right? And the Levites didn't learn how to code. All right, they didn't learn finance, so they didn't get the wherewithal to produce what they needed to survive, which was land. Land gave you fruit of agriculture or animals being raised on that land. Land was the key to everything. Okay, so God giving his people the land was him giving them everything, because everything came from the land in that agri-society. The Levites didn't get that. They had a very special role, which was to take care of all the worship activities in the tabernacle and in the temple, and to guide all the worship and religious stuff, right? And so that was their specialization, and they didn't have land. And so this tithe was what everyone would contribute in order for those Levite people to be able to sustain themselves. Yeah? And it shows you how important it was to God that his people continued to worship him and recognize him, that he set aside one group of people to be dedicated to this. And he mandated everyone to support those people. So this was the first aspect. And this is also so that they keep, the whole notion of the tithe and all of its aspects that we're going to talk about is to draw a connection to the fact that God has provided for them, right? That God is sovereign in their life, that they had faith in God to provide for them at a time, and they shouldn't forget about that. It's interesting in this build-up to this chapter as well, in Deuteronomy, if you go back and read the earlier chapters, God also reminds them, you're getting this land not because you're a huge population, not because you have an overwhelming army, not because you're like super wealthy, not even because you're righteous, because you knuckleheads have done the golden calf and all this crazy stuff, right? It's because I'm giving it to you. So he reminds them, you have not earned this land. This is grace, right? Here is everything you need to survive. And here's how to organize it. So 1/10 for the Levites. There's another 10th that's a really cool aspect that I don't even know. Growing up and hearing about tithing, I had never even heard about this second component of the tithe. Right? This is what we read about in Deuteronomy 14 and chapter 22. Chapter 14, verse 22. It says, be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and olive oil, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if that place is too distant and you have been blessed by the Lord your God and cannot carry all the produce and animals and everything like that, right? Because it's too far away. Then exchange your tithe for silver and take silver with you and go to the place the Lord your God will choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like. Whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, other fermented drinks, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. Right? Also, do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance. So, did you guys know about this part of the tithe? The party tithe? The total indulgent? Like wine, other fermented, like everything, whatever you want, save it up and party. Did you guys know about this? How have they hidden this from the Christian community? Right? But this was it. This was it. Now, why was this being mandated? Right? It is mandated to still honor God, right? Because it's not just a party anywhere. It doesn't say go to the pub and spend your tithe. It's in a place that God has ordained. a place that's close to God. And of course, you guys know, unlike us, we feel like God's everywhere, right? The Jewish folks had special places. The tabernacle, the temple, there were special places where God really hung out. And so they want to go and eat right there in the presence of God with everyone from the community. So it was also a way of drawing people together. Drawing together this whole community that maybe had spread out all over the place. It was also a place where anyone attended. We get further details that orphans, widows, foreigners, Levites who wouldn't even have something to bring to this because they weren't producing, bring everyone together and celebrate. And what would happen at these celebrations, if you guys know the Jewish holidays and celebrations, it's a memory of what God has done. It's a celebration of what God has done for them. So it's a party, but yet again, it's worship. Right? And it's about joy and victory and graciousness. Is this not cool? Right? Does anyone practice this? I'm just curious to know, because I know some of us tithe and like we come and bring like 10% for church offering. Does anyone specifically set aside 10% for celebration, holy celebration? No, I don't think we do it, right? Okay. Interesting. That's the second component. Third component of the tithe was social tithe for the vulnerable. Aside from the Levites and that thing that's covered, there would have been people that wouldn't have had land. Widows might not have land or be associated now with a man in their life who had land, who could work it, right? That's how that society was structured. So they wouldn't have had land. Orphans, some foreigners that were refugees and displaced, they wouldn't have had land to produce. So God has mandated that another piece, another tithe is set aside. A little more complicated. I won't get into this. Like every 3 years, that one would be given and then stored up, right? There's some different technicalities like instructions on this one, but it's another component. It's a social component that was mandatory, set it aside to take care of the vulnerable. It wasn't, we'll wait and see if something happens and then we'll quickly pool resources. It was planned, it was set aside, it was there and ready for when there was a needy person. Yeah? Now, something about each of these three components together is the fact, yeah, and it gives instructions here, yeah? Sorry, I didn't read the verses, but you guys got it, right? So, something about these is, one thing is that this was very systematic. This wasn't optional. It was a mandate from God. So we call it a tithe, but it felt like a tax, right? It felt like a tax, and I don't know how fired up the Israelites were. Did they feel like us with our government taxes? Like, I got to give it to these Levites. They don't do a good job. Temple's a little dirty sometimes, you know. Or was there a great joy? Or, you know, this guy's skimming the funds that are going for the widows. I can see it. I know there's injustice there, corruption. And of course, like all good humans, the Israelites abused this and failed in this. But it was meant to be something that was systematic. It was meant to be a top priority, not like if there's room and you're covered everything else, then you should give this, right? This was a top priority, and it was something that the Israelites believed would set aside, separate this nation from a typical nation. But there was abuses of this, and we know, I'm not going to get into heavy detail, but we know in later books of the Old Testament, if you look in Nehemiah chapter 10 or 13, I think I have it here in my notes, there's a failing to fulfill this. Nehemiah 13. If you look in Malachi chapter 3, if you read Amos, there's criticism that the Israelites have neglected to pay the tithe, that they've not given the Levites what they needed to do their duties, and so the Levites have been forced to go work the land. And so then people have neglected worshiping God, right? And there's consequences then. God isn't happy when this mandate isn't honored. and there's consequences, and Israel falls into all kinds of problems, like you guys know. Then when they resume it and they're faithful, they come back up. But this is the context of the tithe and the history of the tithe in the Old Testament. Yeah. Now, as we transition to the New Testament, and the whole objective of this, like always, is with this beautiful history and scriptures, what does it all mean for us today? How should we be living? How is this thing about setting up a nation and setting up this system in a nation now relevant to us as Christians living in Bangalore in 2026? So we get a little closer to that understanding in the New Testament. Now, we start with Jesus, right? And you guys won't be surprised, I think I've mentioned in the past, that the Bible is chock full, Jesus' teaching is chock full of teachings and examples of money, right? People would think that love would be the most represented thing, but money is all over. Do you know, in the Bible, there's more than 2,300 verses about money and wealth and resources. Yeah? 1/3 of Jesus' parables are about money and resources, right? And about 15% of his teachings overall touch on that topic. So we get a lot of that. And of course, one of the first things that we see Jesus mention in our Gospels is, he kind of goes through the wilderness and appoints, grabs the disciples. And one of the first things we get is a Sermon on the Mount of really a consolidated understanding of Jesus' teaching, right? Does Jesus talk about money and any of these tithing kind of topics in his Sermon on the Mount? One thing he mentions is that if you're giving to the poor and the needy, or not if, he says when you give to the poor and the needy, don't make a big deal about it. So what this tells us is that thing was happening, right? That, the Israelites have kept that tradition, but they're like, hey, I'm giving to help this poor soul. Over here, I'm the good guy, right? Making a big deal about it. And so Jesus said, don't even let one hand to know what the other hand is doing. And then what does he say at the end? He said, set up for yourself treasure in heaven, right? Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be. Right? So this isn't exactly about tithing, but it's Jesus talking about what should we be focused on? What should our view towards resources be? And then we start to see Jesus presenting a very, very different notion of this idea of 10%. And the first thing that I want to do before we start to dive into that, I just want to draw your attention. We often revert back to this guy who asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? Right? And Jesus says, love your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And the second one's just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I just want to draw your attention to these three components of the tithe. The Levitical aspect that was focused on God and worship. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. Right? The social component, which was to take care of the needy. Love your neighbor. And then the self-care, celebratory component of the feast, as yourself. Do you see this? Do you see that all aspects of this tithe were all these things combined? It was worship of God, it was love of neighbor, and it was self-care. Each component, the Levitical one, the party one, and the social one, it wasn't those three things. Those three things had a different emphasis, but all of them contained all of these components. And that's a big, big, heavy truth that you guys got to pause and listen to today. Loving your neighbor is worshiping God. Loving your neighbor is self-care. That's loving yourself. Because that is your brother and your sister. That is you. Right? And so that component, Jesus is reiterating here where he says, loving God is exactly the same as loving your neighbor, which is exactly the same as loving yourself. All of these things are the same. And then you start to get a sense of what Jesus is talking about when he is talking about this notion of percentages and what we should consider as an offering up to God. And this shouldn't be a surprise to us that when we go back and we look at the notion that what God had given to the Israelites was the land, which was providing everything they needed. And when we go back further to creation, God created everything. So when Jesus starts to give us examples, I think one very interesting thing, and I've talked about this before, is the point when Jesus is ministering to a large group of people in a remote place. Right? We see this in several Gospels, but in Matthew, it's in chapter 14. And the disciples flag to Jesus and say, it's a remote place, these people must be hungry, send them away. And what does Jesus tell them? He tells them only one thing. You feed them. Right? Did he say, why don't you take 10% of what you have and put it out there? No, he said, what do you have? And they embarrassingly said, we actually do have food. And Jesus said, put it all out there. And that was the call to the disciples. Take everything that you have and put it out there to share with others. And of course, everyone ate. So we see this different approach, not a fractional approach, but a holistic approach. Now let's talk about Caesar, Daniel. There was someone quizzing Jesus, right, in the temple, and trying to trap him, and said, should we pay that tax to Caesar? And it was a trick question. And Jesus didn't answer it the way that I think we mostly think, like how Daniel was interpreting it, right? I think we tend to say, oh yeah, Jesus was re-emphasizing that you should pay taxes. That was not the message. I'm not saying whether we should or shouldn't pay taxes, but that was not what Jesus was saying. He was shirking out of giving a straight answer while at the same time convicting them. What does he say then? Show me the coin used, right? And asked whose image it is. Caesar's, they replied. And so he said, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Anyone want to have a debate with Jesus about what is Caesar's and what is God's? Does Caesar have anything that isn't God's? Is anything in the world not God's? What in the world does not bear the image of God? God's fingerprint is on everything. Everything you and I own, everything that we use to make or earn what we own, us, the place, it's all God's, right? So the statement here was not like, yeah, pay your taxes, because there's this image on the coin. The message was, everything is God's. Give everything to God. So this concept of 10% goes flying out the window. Just one more point to emphasize this, and again, it's a verse I've talked about, but in Matthew 25 we hear about this parable of the talents. And we hear the story of the owner who leaves individuals with some of his wealth, and then he goes away. And they work with that, and they generate additional income and all of that, and he comes back and asks what they did with it, right? We all know this story of the talents, right? Now, those guys could be very proud of what they made or what they didn't make or whatever, but what were they using to generate that wealth? It wasn't even their funds to start with. And the one guy was so nervous he didn't work it, right? He buried it and said, just take it back. So again, what I want to reiterate here is that drives home the point that sometimes we think of that and we kind of mistakenly translate that what we generate in life, we should be generous with that. And we forget to realize that what we even have, what we even started with, nothing is ours. There's no 10% that I'm giving to God. Everything I have, God has lent to me. Right? Everything I have is a blessing from God. And so when I'm giving it back to God, it's already His. Yeah? And what God is asking for when He calls His disciples is for everything. And He lives this out. Now, was this a dreamy thing that Jesus was talking about in while He was here? And the disciples immediately discarded this and said, no, this is too dreamy. This isn't practical. No, that's not the case, right? Because when we get into the Acts community, the books we have that talk about the Christian community, the early Christian community, what do we find? I should let you guys know there's no mention in the New Testament about the Christian community talking at all about something like a tithe. There's no tithe mentioned. It's mentioned in the New Testament by Jesus when He talks about the Pharisees who make a big deal about their tithing. And it's mentioned in Hebrews when they, again, reference the Old Testament kind of tithing. But there's nothing that talks about the Christian community tithing. What do they talk about? They talk about the Christian community putting all of their resources into the community. Or they talk about the support that they're providing to missionary or another church community in another place. That's what we hear about that. But there's no 10%, there's no limits. Now, how do we think about tithing today? We've rebirthed the term tithing. And I don't know if it's like the people who ran the churches said, we need a good, steady source of income. Let's bring back the tithe. Let's make it seem kind of like a pay-for-service thing, a little membership fee. You come and attend this church, you belong to it, it's like a SaaS software, software as a service, faith as a service. You pay 10% and we'll handle all the stuff. We'll handle the religious relationship with God stuff. We'll do the social stuff. You can outsource all that burden to us. 10%. That's all we ask. I don't think it was like so evil and greedy like that, but I do kind of think we've morphed into that. I don't know if you guys feel that. But I don't think that's what Jesus or the early Christian community understood as this concept of giving and how we see what we have and what we should do with it. I think that view is a view that, and remember, what the Israelites had originally was land and produce, and this changing it to silver was just to get from one place to the other. So what's very difficult for us is we tend to think this is only about money, but of course it's about much more than that. It's about you. It's about your time. It's about your smarts and your creativity and all those amazing gifts that God has given you. And you ask yourself, like we've talked about before, what was our purpose in Genesis for being created? It was to take care of the place and to take care of each other. That was it. And that mission never changed, even when we got thrown out of the garden. It just got a little more difficult. And so I would ask, have we been called to anything different today? Or is the call still the same? Love each other, trust God, take care of the place. That's all we're called to do. Yeah? And so I think what we read this is a call to action for us to reorient and say, how much have we adapted to a nice, good, sustainable model of middle-class aspiration, upper-class aspiration, success, safe enough not to be a burden on others, and then a little bit around the edges, some nice generosity. That is not what we're called to. That's not the biblical message at all, nowhere close. And so I just want to challenge us all that we reflect on our lives, our physical bodies, our minds, how we spend our time, and review. And I'm not biased towards any particular career. Not everyone has to go be a pastor or a missionary to fulfill this. Yeah? But I don't think we're anywhere close with this idea that we all do normal, whatever worldly stuff, and then we come and give 10% to the church. All these things that we confessed in this awesome confession that Rena, what do we say? Let it not be like that. Let there be some change. Please, please, all this pollution, all this violence, all this psychological, emotional stress from it, please, God, let it all change. 10% gone. Back to work. Yeah? Back to creating the waste. Back to being a part of the wars. Back to getting on social media and causing the problem. Yeah? But if we really made that confession, if we really meant what we sang, do what you want with me, with my soul and my heart. You can't touch my bank account or my profession, but my soul and my heart, God, that is all yours. Yeah? Let's be honest with ourselves. And so the call here today is the same call that it is every day. Wake up, guys. Get serious about what you actually believe. And it might seem radical to the rest of the world. Get over that. This is the norm in what Jesus calls us to. Pick up your cross and follow me. Go quit your job that is meaningless. Go get one that is meaningful. You can live off that. I'm 100% certain. Yeah? Do something that addresses these things that we say, oh, God, help change this stuff. God is saying, yeah, please join me. Yeah? Who's with me, right? I'm not going to make you guys raise your hands and make a commitment right now here because this is heavy stuff, right? Who's quitting their job tomorrow? No. This is heavy, tough stuff, but I'm telling you, it's scarier on this side than on the other side. You make that call and you find out, do you have faith? Because the things will come. In that verse of the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount, when it says, put your faith in heaven and stuff like that, then down below, it says, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious for what you're going to eat and what you're going to wear and everything like that. And again, I've said this before, faith is not that intellectually I believe there is a God. That's not the faith we're talking about. Faith is, I trust that God. And that God would never call me to do something that would hurt me, right? Not that we're not going to experience pain, but God doesn't want us to fall into a death spiral. You might be uncomfortable. I will almost guarantee you will be uncomfortable. But God is calling you only to things that He knows are the very best for you. And so my prayer and my desire for us is that, again, this little tiny place of Wellspring, we could have such an amazing impact because I know the gifts that you all have, that we have in this room. It's so much beyond our checkbooks. There's so much talent, so much love and amazing capability here, and amazing things are getting done. Let's lean into that, yeah? Let's make that example that 100% God, I'm yours. And let's just see what happens.